Helena vividly remembered the day everything changed. There were no screams, no dramatic scenes worthy of a movie, just a silence that seemed to weigh on her chest. She was returning from spending a week at her sister's house, in the hinterland, and as the bus approached the city, she thought about the aroma of the coffee she would make upon arrival. However, as she got out of the taxi in front of her house, the sight she encountered stopped her in her tracks. Her furniture, her clothes, her photographs, everything was piled up in the garden, as if they were objects destined for the trash. An envelope with her name on it was waiting on the gate, taped shut. She opened it right there, with trembling hands. Inside, a brief message, written by her own son, Ricardo: "Mom, my in-laws are going to live here. There's no more room for you." The impact was so cold and dry that for a moment she didn't know if it was real. For a few seconds, she thought maybe there had been a misunderstanding. That something urgent had happened. She rang the doorbell, but no one answered. She looked out the living room window and saw new boxes, different furniture, clear signs that this wasn't something improvised. She understood that everything had been calculated to coincide with her absence, that every detail was designed to make her return and no longer have a place there. She felt a mixture of anger, sadness, and an unexpected clarity. Knocking on the door or calling her son through tears wouldn't change anything. She had already been removed from that space she had supported and cared for years. So, she gathered what she could fit into 2 suitcases and went directly to the small apartment she had secretly bought years before, under the excuse that it was an investment. That day, for the first time, she was grateful that she had thought of herself. Upon arriving at the apartment, Helena felt a strange mix of relief and solitude. The place was clean, untouched, just as she had left it after her last visit to air it out. She put her suitcases by the door and stood in the middle of the living room, listening to the echo of her own footsteps. There were no photos on the walls or familiar objects in sight, only the smell of sealed wood and light dust. It was small, but hers. She poured a glass of water from the cooler she kept there and sat on the sofa, feeling the fatigue of the trip and the tension of the moment blend together. She didn't cry immediately, rather. She remained silent, processing everything that had happened in the last few hours. With her phone in her hand, she checked if Ricardo had tried to call her. Nothing. Not a message, not a sign of concern. Their last conversation, days before, had been normal, or at least that's what it had seemed. There were no warnings, no arguments that foreshadowed what was to come. She understood that this wasn't an impulsive decision, but something they had planned in advance, waiting for the right moment to execute it. That certainty hurt her more than the act itself. And it was there, in the silence of that apartment, that she began to think about her strategy. She wasn't willing to become a passive victim of her own life. The next day, Helena got up early, even though she had barely slept. She made a simple coffee in the small coffee maker she kept there and sat by the window, watching the street outside. Her mind was clear. The first thing was to confirm what she sensed, that the house was still in her name. She searched the folder of documents she always kept organized, and there it was, the original deed, with no transfer made. She felt a kind of cold calm holding that paper in her hand. She wasn't going to act on impulse or shouting, but with actions. She knew that any wrongly spoken word could be used against her, and at that moment, she understood that distance and silence would be her best allies. That same day, she called a lawyer recommended by a friend. She explained the situation in detail, from the bill on the gate to the evidence that the property was legally hers. The lawyer listened without interruption and, when she finished, assured her that they could send a formal eviction notice. Helena agreed without hesitation. She hung up the phone, feeling a weight lifted from her chest. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't reacting to appease others, but acting to protect herself. That small change in her approach gave her unexpected strength. 2 days later, the notification was delivered. Helena wasn't present to see Ricardo and Camila's reaction. She didn't want unnecessary confrontations. However, within a few hours, her phone began ringing insistently. First, there were calls from her son, then text messages that ranged in tone from pleading to accusatory. "How could you do this to me? You have no heart, think of your grandchildren." Helena read each word with a sinking feeling, but she didn't respond. She knew any response would open the door for them to try to manipulate her. That silence, though difficult, was a barrier she had decided to put up to protect her dignity. On the 3rd day, the pressure mounted. Camila called her directly, adopting a sweet tone that Helena recognized only too well, the same one she used when she wanted something. She offered to pay her monthly rent for the house, claiming that this way they could keep everything in the family, and that she wouldn't have to worry about a thing. Helena took a deep breath before answering with a single sentence, "It's not about money." She hung up without waiting for a response. It was the first time she felt she was setting a real boundary, and although her heart was beating fast, she also felt incredibly firm in her decision. The following weeks were a constant test of emotional resilience. Ricardo went from sending her angry messages to trying to stir up her guilt, reminding her of moments in the past when she had supported him. Helena, although she felt a lump in her throat reading them, told herself she couldn't let herself be swept away by nostalgia. She had spent too many years sacrificing her peace to sustain a relationship that, in the end, didn't return even the slightest respect. Now, every day she stood her ground was a small victory, even if sometimes that victory felt lonely. As the legal process unfolded, Helena began to rediscover her own space. She organized the apartment with the few things she had brought, hung some old photos, and bought plants for the window. She also began to go out more. She visited a nearby cafe every morning, where the owner, a kind older man, always saved her favorite table. These small, everyday gestures, which had previously gone unnoticed, began to give her a sense of belonging. Little by little, the apartment ceased to be a simple refuge and became her new home. A month later, the ruling arrived. The judge ordered Ricardo and Camila to vacate the house within 30 days. Helena received the news with a mixture of relief and sadness. This wasn't about winning against her son, but rather about ending a situation that was emotionally draining her. She knew that, from that moment on, their relationship would change forever, and she accepted that perhaps that was the price of regaining her dignity. She kept the copy of the ruling in the same folder where she kept the deed, as a reminder that she had been able to defend herself. During that month, she avoided passing by the house's street. She didn't want to see the move or hear comments from curious neighbors. Instead, she focused on her daily life. She resumed painting classes she had abandoned decades ago, began walking in the park every afternoon, and enrolled in a cooking workshop. In each activity, she discovered a little piece of herself she had put aside for years to meet the expectations of others. Although there were still moments when the memory of the betrayal hurt, she also felt she was building a new version of her life, one that was freer and more authentic. When the house was finally empty, Helena went with a lawyer and a locksmith to change the locks. She walked through each room in silence, observing the marks on the walls, the empty spaces where furniture and mementos had once been. She didn't feel the nostalgia she had feared. Instead, there was a sense of closure, as if she were turning the last page of a book she had read too many times. She decided she wouldn't keep the property. Selling it would be the definitive way to cut ties with that stage of her life and open a new chapter without ties. The sales process was quick. A young couple, excited about building their first home, fell in love with the house and closed the deal within weeks. When Helena received the payment, she felt secure for the first time in many years. It wasn't just the money, although financial independence gave her peace of mind, but the certainty that now everything she had depended solely on her. With some of that money, she began planning trips and activities she'd only previously imagined. For the first time, her future was in her hands, without conditions or guilt imposed by others. Her first trip was to a coastal town she'd always wanted to visit. She booked a small oceanfront hotel and spent days walking along the shore, collecting shells and enjoying the sound of the waves. She didn't have a strict itinerary or try to please anyone. Each day she did whatever she wanted. That freedom, at first strange, began to feel natural. On one of those walks, she joined a group of older people who practiced beach exercises every morning. They invited her to participate, and she soon found herself laughing and chatting with strangers who, little by little, began to become friends. Upon her return, she decided to maintain that openness. She enrolled in a support group for older adults who had experienced abandonment or family abuse. At first, hearing others' stories was painful, but also comforting. She wasn't alone in her experience. She discovered that sharing her own story, unadorned and unashamed, helped others find courage to make difficult decisions. That community became an important pillar in her new life, reminding her that wounds can heal when they are transformed into strength and mutual support. As the months passed, Helena began to recover habits she had unwittingly abandoned. She started reading before bed, preparing her own favorite recipes, and listening to music while cleaning the house. These were simple things, but they gave her a sense of control and joy she couldn't remember feeling in years. She even rediscovered her love of photography. She bought a used camera and began going out on weekends to capture everyday scenes of the city. She didn't do it for professional purposes, but for the pure pleasure of capturing images of moments that brought her peace. Meanwhile, Ricardo tried to get closer again. First with short messages, then with calls that always ended with mentions of financial problems. Helena listened attentively, but maintained the same stance. She was willing to see her grandchildren whenever they wanted, but not to resume the dynamics that had hurt her. She learned to recognize attempts at manipulation disguised as concern, and no longer felt that automatic obligation to rescue him. She understood that setting boundaries wasn't an act of revenge, but of self-care. 2 years after that day, Helena celebrated her birthday surrounded by new friends she had made on trips, in workshops, and in the support group. The table was laden with dishes prepared by everyone, and laughter filled the small apartment that now felt completely hers. There were no luxuries, but there was a warmth she hadn't experienced in a long time. As she blew out the candles, she vividly remembered the silence of that day when she found her things in the garden. At the time, that silence had been painful, almost unbearable. Now, she saw it as the beginning of the life she had always deserved. That evening, after the guests had left, she poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the open window, letting the fresh air in. She looked out at the city lights and thought about how far she'd come since then. She no longer felt the fear of being alone, nor that anxiety to be accepted at any cost. Her home, her decisions, and her time were completely hers. She'd learned that reclaiming her voice isn't always a noisy act. Sometimes it begins quietly, but a silence that marks the beginning of a freedom that no one can take away from you. In the following months, Helena continued exploring new ways to spend her time and nurture her independence. She enrolled in language classes, something she had always wanted to do but had never found the right time. She discovered that learning gave her a different energy, as if her mind was being renewed along with her life. In one of those classes, she met people with stories as intense as hers, and from those conversations, plans for group trips and cultural tours of the city were born. She felt like, finally, she was making conscious choices about who to spend her time with and how. Ricardo, for his part, continued trying to re-establish a closer relationship, but Helena no longer gave in to the urge to solve his life. She had accepted that her role as a mother wasn't to nullify herself to support an adult son, but to maintain a healthy bond, one based, above all, on respect. And although she couldn't erase the past, she could decide what she allowed in her present. In her heart, she had made peace with the idea that some relationships can only be saved when everyone is willing to change. Until then, she would cling to the life she had rebuilt with such effort, a life in which, finally, she was at the center. One day, while organizing some photos on her computer, Helena found a folder with old pictures of Lucas and Sofia, her grandchildren. She smiled at the sight of their young age, remembering the time she had babysat for them when Ricardo and Camila needed to go out. She decided to print some of them and put them in an album to save for when they visited. She didn't want her relationship with them to be affected by conflicts with their parents. For Helena, the children weren't to blame for the adults' decisions. That simple gesture reminded her that she could continue to be an important figure in their lives, from a place of safety and balance. Over time, the grandchildren's visits became more frequent. They would spend entire afternoons with her, eating homemade cookies, playing cards, or going out to the nearby park. These moments reinforced her certainty that she had made the right decision by not allowing resentment to define her future. Helena saw the trust and genuine affection in their eyes, and that was enough to confirm that she was sowing a bond based on love and respect. Silently, she promised herself that, no matter what happened to the adults, she would always be a refuge for them. A few months later, Helena decided to do something that would symbolize the final closure of that painful period. She sold some of the belongings she still had from her previous home and used the money to completely redecorate her apartment. She painted the walls in light colors, bought new furniture, and ordered shelves for her books and photo albums. Each physical change in the space seemed to further erase any traces of what she had experienced. Now, every corner spoke of her, her tastes, and the life she had chosen to build. One quiet afternoon, while watering the plants on her balcony, Helena found herself surprised to realize that she no longer felt the tightness in her chest that had plagued her for months after being evicted from her own home. She had learned to breathe without fear, to walk without feeling she had to justify herself to anyone. Looking at the horizon, she understood that what had begun as a family betrayal had become the starting point for recovering something much more valuable, her autonomy and her peace. And with serene calm, she accepted that the silence of that day had, in reality, been the sound of her freedom being born. Over the years, that episode ceased to be an open wound and became a story Helena shared only when she felt she could help someone else. In the support group, many people saw themselves reflected in her experience and asked her for advice on how to take the first step toward escaping unjust situations. Her response was always the same: don't wait for someone to give you permission to live in peace. Start today, even if it's with something small. She knew that her strength didn't come from a miraculous moment, but from the combination of firm decisions she made despite her fear. On her last birthday, surrounded by friends, with Lucas and Sofia helping her blow out the candles, Helena realized she no longer needed to validate her life through the approval of her son or daughter-in-law. The woman who had once been expelled from her own home was now the master of her destiny, and every step she took was her own. She smiled, not for what she had lost, but for what she had gained, an authentic life, free of guilt and full of opportunities. And as the echo of laughter filled the room, she understood that she had closed the cycle forever,